The Monsanto Utopia. Chapter 1: The Jungle Blueprint. Welcome to Synapse Daily. The date is October 12, 1963. A humid heat clings to the skin. Inside a boardroom, the air is cold. Men in gray suits stare at maps. The maps show the heart of Brazil. Green forests stretch for thousands of miles. To the board, this is not nature. This is raw, unrefined capital. They see a grid over the jungle. Monsanto's logo sits atop the blueprint. This was the dream of total efficiency. They called it an agricultural utopia. A city built entirely for the harvest. No weeds would ever grow here. No pests would survive the perimeter. The soil would be scientifically perfect. Water would flow exactly where needed. Technology was the new god of Earth. The 1963 plan was a bold vision. It promised a world without any hunger. But every utopia has a steep price. Was this for people or for profit? The blueprints smelled of fresh ink. They also smelled of cold, hard chemicals. The vision was massive and terrifying. Chapter 2: The Green Revolution's Shadow. The global population was surging in 1963. Billions of mouths needed daily bread. Experts predicted a dark, starving future. Famine was the world's greatest fear. The Cold War added a sharp edge. Hungry nations often turned to revolution. The West needed a technological miracle. They called this movement the Green Revolution. It was a war against old nature. Monsanto led the charge with chemistry. They promised a scientific explosion of food. Traditional farming was seen as obsolete. Ancient wisdom was replaced by lab reports. High-yield seeds were the new gold. These seeds required a specific ritual. You needed the right chemical cocktail. Without the chemicals, the seeds died. It was a perfect, closed economic loop. Progress was marching into the tropics. The shadow of industry grew very long. Nature was about to be rewritten. The lab was the new church. Chapter 3: Brazil's Untapped Frontier. Brazil's interior was a mystery to many. The Cerrado region was vast and wild. It covers 2 million square kilometers. Most called it a useless, dry wasteland. The soil was old and very acidic. Traditional crops simply withered and died. But Monsanto's chemists saw a goldmine. They tested the red, dusty earth. They found a way to fix nature. Massive amounts of lime could balance acid. Phosphate would provide the missing energy. The Cerrado was a giant, empty lab. The Brazilian government wanted modern progress. They welcomed the corporate giants with joy. Vast highways began to pierce the trees. The silence of the wild was broken. Trucks carried tons of white powder. The transformation of the frontier had begun. A new empire was taking root. The dust turned from red to green. Chapter 4: The Company Town Concept. Imagine a city with one single pulse. Every heartbeat belongs to the company. This was the 1963 Monsanto design. They planned a fully integrated society. Workers lived in prefabricated corporate housing. The company store provided every single meal. Children attended schools funded by the lab. They learned the chemistry of the future. There were no independent local shops. There were no outside competing interests. Efficiency was the only social law. Data flowed from the fields to offices. Management tracked every single seed's progress. The town was a living, breathing machine. It was the ultimate dream of control. Privacy was a concept of the past. Loyalty was measured in bushel yields. It was a paradise of pure production. But machines do not have human souls. Would you trade freedom for full bellies? Chapter 5: Engineering the Perfect Seed. Nature is chaotic and very unpredictable. Standard seeds vary from farm to farm. Monsanto wanted to eliminate all variables. In 1963, the genetic race accelerated. They sought a universal crop variety, a seed that responded perfectly to chemicals. This was the birth of biological hardware. The seed was no longer a gift. The seed became a patented industrial tool. If you bought the seed, you obeyed. You could not save seeds for next year. That was seen as a legal crime. Biology was now under a corporate seal. The laboratory replaced the natural season. Scientists worked under bright fluorescent lights. They spliced and tested for maximum profit. Plants became vertical factories of starch. The 1963 models were incredibly ambitious. They wanted to own the very beginning. Life itself was being branded and sold. The code of life had a price. Chapter 5: Engineering the Perfect Seed. Nature is chaotic and very unpredictable. Standard seeds vary from farm to farm. Monsanto wanted to eliminate all variables. In 1963, the genetic race accelerated. They sought a universal crop variety, a seed that responded perfectly to chemicals. This was the birth of biological hardware. The seed was no longer a gift. The seed became a patented industrial tool. If you bought the seed, you obeyed. You could not save seeds for next year. That was seen as a legal crime. Biology was now under a corporate seal. The laboratory replaced the natural season. Scientists worked under bright fluorescent lights. They spliced and tested for maximum profit. Plants became vertical factories of starch. The 1963 models were incredibly ambitious. They wanted to own the very beginning. Life itself was being branded and sold. The code of life had a price. Seeds were treated like microchips in 1963. Each grain held a specific chemical promise. Farmers signed contracts written by city lawyers. Traditional knowledge was mocked as primitive. The lab-grown seed was the only truth. It was designed to crave Monsanto's fertilizers. Without the specific spray, the plant failed. It was a biological lock and key. The key was held by the company. The farmer was now a dependent client. The cycle of life was now industrial. Sunlight was secondary to the chemical formula. The 1963 prototypes were remarkably consistent. They grew at the exact same height. They ripened on the exact same day. This allowed for massive, automated machine harvests. Humans were being phased out of farming. The seed was the first digital soldier. It marched across the Brazilian plains. Chapter 6: The Logistics of Empire. Moving chemicals requires massive infrastructure. Roads had to pierce the thick forest. Trains needed to carry tons of phosphate. The 1963 plan required incredible logistics. Millions of dollars flowed into the dirt. It was a logistical ballet of steel. The cost of progress was rising fast. Investors watched the bottom line closely. Nature, however, had its own plans. The Amazon basin is not easily tamed. Mud swallowed the heavy construction equipment. Insects destroyed the newly laid wooden tracks. Tropical diseases thinned the labor force. But Monsanto's capital was seemingly infinite. They built bridges over ancient, dark rivers. They carved landing strips in the jungle. Supply chains stretched back to St. Louis. Every gallon of fuel was carefully tracked. Every bag of lime was a calculated risk. The jungle felt like a silent enemy. It watched the machines tear its skin. The planners ignored the local climate warnings. They believed engineering could solve any problem. Calculations replaced the rhythm of the rain. The utopia required a perfect supply line. One break in the chain meant disaster. They built silos that touched the clouds. They paved roads that led to nowhere. The empire was made of concrete and debt. Chapter 7: The 1964 Political Upheaval. Political winds in Brazil were shifting fast. 1963 ended with a sense of dread. President João Goulart talked about land reform. He wanted to give soil to peasants. This terrified the corporate giants in America. Monsanto's utopia needed stable, friendly leaders. Land reform was the enemy of monopoly. The U.S. government watched Brazil very closely. The Red Scare dominated every single meeting. Would Brazil turn toward the Soviet model? Corporations whispered in the ears of generals. In early 1964, the tanks finally rolled. A military coup changed everything overnight. The dream of the peasant was crushed. The dream of the corporation was saved. The new generals loved industrial order. They saw Monsanto as a strategic partner. The utopia now had military protection. Dissent was silenced with iron and fire. The fields were now guarded by soldiers. Safety for the seeds meant fear for people. The 1963 plans were suddenly accelerated. The frontier was open for total conquest. Chapter 8: The Ecological Price Tag. The Cerrado began to change color quickly. The diverse brush was burned away totally. Monoculture replaced the complex web of life. One single species of corn covered miles. One single variety of soy ruled supreme. The birds of the savanna lost homes. The jaguars retreated into the shrinking shadows. Monsanto's chemicals soaked into the groundwater. The miracle fertilizers had a hidden side. Nitrates began to choke the local streams. Algae blooms killed the Silver River fish. The soil started to lose its soul. It became a dead medium for chemicals. The utopia was becoming a sterile desert. Only the patented crops were allowed life. Everything else was labeled a weed. The air smelled of sulfur and ozone. Planes sprayed poison from the morning sky. The mist settled on the worker's skin. No one asked about the long-term cost. The yield was the only metric used. Profit was the only survival instinct left. The land was screaming in silence. Chapter 9: The Ghost of the Utopia. By the late 1960s, reality hit. The utopia did not look like paradise. It looked like a massive, dusty factory. The company towns felt cold and hollow. Social tension boiled under the strict surface. Workers felt like parts of a machine. The promised wealth did not reach everyone. It stayed at the top of the pyramid. The 1963 blueprints were now weathered yellow. The dream of ending hunger was different. Brazil was exporting food while people starved. The crops were for global markets only. Local markets could not afford the price. That agricultural utopia was a global hub. It was not a home for Brazilians. It was a battery for the world. The ghost of the plan still remains. You can see it in the grid lines. You can taste it in the water. The 1963 vision set the modern stage. We still live in Monsanto's shadow today. The experiment never truly ended for us. Chapter 10: The Debt of the Soil. The chemistry of 1963 was not free. Fertilizers require massive amounts of natural gas. The soil became addicted to these inputs. Without them, the land turned to dust. Farmers entered a cycle of permanent debt. They borrowed money for the next bag. They mortgaged their homes for the spray. Monsanto's utopia was a high-interest loan. The yields were high, but costs rose. The profit margin stayed with the company. Local families began to lose their independence. They were now cogs in a global machine. The soil was physically changing its structure. Microbes died under the heavy chemical load. Earthworms vanished from the red Brazilian dirt. The land felt harder under the boots. It was no longer a living partner. It was a dry, thirsty industrial floor. The utopia required constant, expensive feeding. Nature's free gifts were now billed monthly. Economic chains were stronger than iron ones. The dream was a beautifully designed trap. Chapter 11: The Resistance of the Seed. Life always finds a way to fight. Insects began to evolve in the 1960s. They developed a taste for the poison. Superbugs emerged from the treated fields. Monsanto responded with even stronger chemicals. It was a biological arms race in Brazil. The 1963 blueprints didn't predict this war. Nature refused to follow the corporate script. Weeds grew thicker and more resistant too. The utopia required more and more toxicity. The cost of control was rising exponentially. Workers began to report strange new illnesses. Respiratory problems became common in the towns. Skin rashes appeared after the morning spray. The perfect city had a sick heart. The corporate doctors stayed very silent then. Data on health was suppressed or ignored. The harvest was more important than breath. The struggle for the land became violent. Peasants started to reclaim the forest edges. The dream was cracking under biological pressure. Chapter 12: The Global Export Engine. By 1970, the 1963 vision was reality. Brazil became a global agricultural powerhouse. Giant ships left the ports every day. They carried the Monsanto-style soy and corn. The world's cattle were fed by Brazil. The utopia was a success for markets. But the local plate remained very empty. Basic food prices in Brazil actually rose. The best land was for export only. The Green Revolution had two very faces. One face was shiny, modern, and rich. The other was hungry, displaced, and tired. Small farmers were pushed to the cities. Favelas grew as the corporate fields expanded. The social geography of Brazil was rewritten. The 1963 plan was a geopolitical tool. It secured the food supply for allies. It left the host nation with scars. The utopia served a distant, invisible master. St. Louis celebrated the massive quarterly profits. The Cerrado was forever changed by ink. Chapter 13: The Legacy of Synapse. We look back at 1963 today. The Monsanto Agricultural Utopia is not gone. It simply evolved into our modern world. The blueprints are now digital and global. Most of our food carries this DNA. The 1963 experiment defined the 21st century. We live in a world of patents. We live in a world of monoculture. Is this the progress we truly wanted? Or did we lose something very vital? The utopia proved that nature is fragile. It proved that control is an illusion. The perfect city is now a lesson. It teaches us about greed in science. It teaches us about the price of food. Every bite of bread has a history. Every seed has a corporate owner now. We are the children of that 1963 dream. The jungle still remembers the old ways. But the machines never truly stopped humming. Thank you for listening to Synapse Daily. The past is always growing under us. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. Stay human.